I've watched men lose their houses over a pair of jacks. I've watched a grown man cry over a truck. But I never once, in 40 years of running the sorriest storage lot in 3 counties, watched a whole room full of hard people go quiet the way they went quiet the night a broke cowboy named Eli Kade won Unit 114. He didn't win money. There wasn't a dime of money in that unit. The man who lost it was worth more than this whole town put together, and he bet it like it was garbage, because to him, I think, it was worse than garbage. It was the thing he couldn't stand to look at and couldn't stand to throw away. Eli won it fair, 1 card, and what he found behind that orange rolling door didn't make him rich. It made a rich man kneel down in the dirt of my lot and beg, a stranger, for something money had never once been able to buy him. Stay with me, because I've told this story maybe a dozen times, and I have never once gotten to the end of it dry-eyed, and I don't expect to tonight either. The AC in the back room of Delano's had been dead since spring, and nobody'd fixed it, so we were all sitting there sweating over a green felt table with the ceiling fan just moving the hot air around like a spoon in soup. 6 of us. 5 who could afford to be there, and 1 who couldn't. That one was Eli. I'd known the boy, he was maybe 30, but out here you call anybody a boy who still owes more than he owns. I'd known him about 2 years by then. He'd come through working the fall gather for the Pruits, then stuck around doing day work, fixing fence, breaking the occasional colt that nobody sane would get on, cleaning stalls for cash. He slept in a camper with a cracked windshield behind the co-op. Owned 2 shirts. Owned a horse he wouldn't have sold to feed himself. And I know that for a fact because I offered once, when he looked hungry, and he told me no so soft and so final that I never asked again. He shouldn't have been at that table. The buy-in was $200, and I happen to know Eli didn't have $200 in the world. But Cyrus Vane had bought his seat. That was the strange part. That was the part none of us understood yet. Cyrus Vane. If you're not from here, the name means nothing, so let me lay it out. Vane owned the biggest spread east of the river, plus a chunk of the oil under it, plus the bank that half the ranchers in the county owed money to, mine included. He was maybe 60. Silver hair, iron jeans, a watch worth more than my house. He had a way of looking at you like he was already deciding what you were worth in a foreclosure. Cold as a well bottom. His wife had left him years back, and everybody said it was the money that did it, but I never believed that. Money doesn't make a man that cold. Money just gives a cold man room to spread out. He came into Delano's back room that night alone, which was itself a shock because Vane didn't gamble. Vane owned. And he pointed one finger at Eli, who was leaning in the doorway watching, hat in his hands, not planning on playing anything, and he said, "You, sit down. I'll cover you." Eli looked at him like he'd been asked to eat a light bulb. "Sir, I don't." "Sit down," Vane said again. Not mean. Tired. Like a man who'd already had the conversation in his head and lost patience with the version of you that hadn't caught up yet. So Eli sat. "Now I need you to understand I dealt that game. I wasn't playing. I was there because Delano trusts my hands and my ledger, and I keep a little notebook of who owes what so nobody gets shot in the parking lot afterward. So I had a front row seat to the whole slow, strange thing, and I wrote most of it down that same night in my truck because I could already feel it was going to be one I'd want to keep straight. The first 2 hours were nothing. Ordinary poker. Money moving around the table like water finding low ground, mostly finding its way to a rancher named Bo who could not lose that night if he'd tried, and Bo tried because winning off drunk friends embarrassed him. Eli played careful, played scared honestly, which is how a man plays with somebody else's stake. He folded good hands. He never chased. He was up maybe $80, and it clearly terrified him to be up $80, like the ceiling might come down on him for the crime of it. Vane, meanwhile, barely looked at his cards. He drank. He wasn't a drinker either. I'd never once seen the man take anything but coffee, but that night he went through most of a bottle of the good rye Delano keeps behind the register, and with every glass his eyes got farther away, and I started to get a bad feeling in my stomach that I couldn't have named for you. You spend enough years around desperate people, you learn to smell a certain kind of night coming. It smells like a man who's already decided something. Around midnight the others started peeling off. Bo went home with his winnings and a guilty conscience. The two Havorson brothers went home flat broke and cheerful, the way only brothers can. That left three at the table: Vane, Eli, and a fella named Del Rucker who ran the tire shop and stayed mostly because he'd never in his life been at a table with Cyrus Vane and wasn't about to leave first. That's when Vane put the paper on the table. He'd had it folded in his shirt pocket the whole time. I'd seen the corner of it and figured it was a check, or a note, some rich man's business he'd forgotten to file. He unfolded it slow and smoothed it flat with the side of his hand and slid it to the center of the felt. "Title," he said, "Unit 114, Holly's lot." He looked at me when he said my name and I felt it like a cold finger. "Contents included, free and clear. I've paid the rent on it 11 years running. It's mine to bet." Del laughed, thinking it was a joke. Then he stopped laughing because Vane wasn't. "What's in it?" Del said. "Everything I own that matters," Vane said, "and God help me." The way he said it, flat, exhausted, almost gentle, nobody at that table laughed again. "Now here's a thing you have to know about my lot. Unit 114 was the one nobody ever saw. Vane paid cash once a year for 11 years, and in 11 years I never once saw him open that door. Not once. I'd walk the rows some nights when I couldn't sleep, and I'd pass 114, and I always had the feeling, you'll think I'm a foolish old man, I always had the feeling there was something in there holding its breath." Eli was staring at the title like it was a snake. "I don't want your unit, Mr. Vane," he said quietly. "I don't want any of this. You covered me. I'll give you back what's yours and I'll walk out and we'll call it." "One hand," Vane said. "One card if you like. High card. You beat me, it's yours, everything in it. The paperwork's already in your name if you win. I had Cheryl at the courthouse draw it up this afternoon." He smiled then, and it was the worst smile I ever saw on a human face. Because there was no cruelty in it and no joy in it either. There was just a man setting something down that he'd been carrying so long his hands had grown around it. "I've been trying to lose this for a long time, son. I'd be obliged if you'd let me." You could have heard a moth land. Eli looked at me. God knows why me, because I was the oldest one there maybe, or because I dealt the cards, or because when a young man doesn't know what's right he'll look at whoever's got the most gray in his beard and hope to borrow some sense. And I didn't have any to give him. I just gave him the littlest nod, not telling him to do it, just telling him, whatever this is, it's real and it's yours to answer now. I shuffled. I let Del cut. My hands weren't as steady as I'd have liked. "High card," I said. "Aces high, one draw each." Vane went first. He didn't even look. He reached out and turned over the top card, and it was the 8 of clubs, and he looked at it with about as much interest as you'd look at a fly. Eli's hand hovered over the deck for a long time, long enough that Del shifted in his seat, long enough that I could hear the dead AC ticking as it cooled, and the fan going around and around. I've thought about that pause a lot since. I don't think Eli was hopping to win. I think Eli was hopping to lose. I think he'd have given a year of his life to turn over a 2 and hand that terrible folded paper back across the table and go sleep in his camper, and never know what was behind that orange door. He turned over the jack of hearts. Nobody moved. Vane looked at the jack for a long moment, and then something went out of his shoulders, not disappointment. Relief. The relief of a man who's finally allowed to fall. "There," he said softly and stood up, and his chair scraped in the quiet. He set his key ring on the table and worked one brass key off it, worn smooth, and set it on top of the title. "Rent's paid through October. After that it's your headache, Hollies." He put his hat on. At the door he stopped, not turning around, and he said one more thing, and I've never forgotten it. "Don't sell it sight unseen," he said. "Whatever you do, Look inside first. You'll want to know what you're throwing away. And then Cyrus Vane walked out into the dark and left a broke cowboy sitting there, holding the deed to the one thing on earth he'd never been able to bury. Eli didn't open it that night. He sat in his camper, he told me later, and looked at that brass key on the little fold-down table until the sun came up, and he didn't sleep a minute. He said the strangest part wasn't the winning. The strangest part was Vane's face. He said, "Hollies, I've had rich men look at me like dirt my whole life. That was the first time one of them ever looked at me like I was rescuing him from something, and I couldn't stand it." He came to the lot around 9 in the morning. I'd already been up, of course, I'm always up. I walked him down the row myself. I'll be honest, I wanted to see. 11 years of wondering, and now here was the boy with the key. The lock was stiff from never being touched. Eli had to jiggle it. The door came up loud, the way those old rolling doors do, screaming on their track, and then the morning light poured in past our shadows, and we both stood there. I don't know what either of us expected. Gold maybe, guns, cash in a wall safe. That's what your mind does. It fills a rich man's secret room with rich man things. It was a boy's bedroom. Not a room exactly. It was a storage unit, concrete floor, tin walls, but somebody had moved a whole bedroom into it and set it up like the boy might come home any minute. A single bed against the wall with a quilt on it, blue, hand-stitched, faded. A dresser. Rodeo posters tacked up with care, corners squared. A shelf of trophies, the little gold men on top frozen mid-ride, and every one of them dusted, you could see it. Somebody had come in over the years and dusted them, and it wasn't me, so it had to have been Vane, alone in the dark, wiping the dust off his dead son's trophies with a rag. Because that's who it was. It didn't take a genius. There was a framed photo on the dresser. Vane, 20 years younger and smiling, actually smiling, which I'd never seen, with his arm around a boy of maybe 15 in a hat too big for him. And around the frame, the whole surface of that dresser, were the leavings of a young man's life. A belt buckle he'd won, a harmonica, a jar of pennies, a ticket stub. A cast, an actual plaster arm cast, cut off and kept, with names signed on it in fading marker. Eli made a sound behind me. I turned, and he had his hat off and pressed against his chest, and he was just standing in the doorway, not able to come in, like it was a church, like his boots weren't clean enough. "Whose is it?" he whispered, though we both already knew. We found out the rest slow over that morning, because you don't rifle a thing like that, you go careful, you go respectful. There was a shoebox of report cards. Daniel Cyrus Vane. There was a scrapbook a mother had kept, so there'd been a mother in it once before she left, and I understood then. I understood the whole cold ruin of that man in a way I never had. There was a hospital bracelet, the little plastic kind, and next to it, folded in a plastic sleeve to keep it safe, a program from a funeral. And the dates on that program told me Danny Vane had died at 24 years old, 11 years back, the exact year Vane first rented the unit. He'd bought his boy's whole life a hiding place and paid the rent on it for 11 years and dusted the trophies, and never once opened the door in daylight where somebody might see. And then one night he'd gotten drunk enough to try to hand it to a stranger because he could not carry it one more year, and he could not, would not, throw it away. Eli sat down on the concrete floor at some point. Just sat down in the doorway with his back against the frame and his hat in his hands, and looked at that room, and he didn't say anything for a long, long time. "He wanted to lose it," Eli finally said. "You heard him. He said he'd been trying to lose it for a long time." "He did say that." "That ain't losing it, Hollies." Eli's voice cracked right down the middle. He wanted somebody to have it that wouldn't just haul it to the dump. He was looking for somebody to hand his boy to. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. "Why me? Why'd he pick me? I got nothing. I'm nobody." I didn't have an answer. I've thought about it since, and I think maybe that was the reason. Vane had spent his whole life around people who wanted things from him, and there sat a broke cowboy in a doorway who'd offered to hand back a fortune he hadn't earned because it didn't feel right to keep it. Maybe when you've been lied to and used your whole life, you get a nose for the one man in the room who won't do it. Maybe Vane had been watching Eli for 2 years the same way. I don't know. Some things you don't get to know. Here's the part where it turns, though. Here's the part I've never been able to tell without stopping to get my voice back. There was a footlocker under the bed. Eli found it last because it was the hardest to get to, wedged in with a horse blanket. Old army footlocker, and inside it, on top, wrapped in a dish towel, was a bundle of letters. 60, 70 of them, all addressed in the same young hand, all to the same person. To Dad. And every single one of them was still sealed. Eli held them in his lap like they might burn him. He wrote to his own father, he said slowly, working it out loud, and no, look at the postmarks, Hollies. His hands were shaking now. They're not from Danny, look. These are Vane's handwriting. He wrote them. He wrote letters to his dead son, and he wrote 'em and sealed 'em and put 'em in a box under the bed. And then, near the bottom of the stack, one letter that wasn't in Vane's handwriting. One that was in the younger hand from the report cards. One with a real stamp on it and a real cancellation mark, dated 11 years back, dated. I saw when Eli turned it over with his whole body gone still, 4 days before the funeral. A letter Danny had mailed to his father, that had come to the house while the boy lay dying in the hospital, or maybe just after. And it had never been opened either. Eli looked up at me from the floor of that unit with the whole terrible weight of it in his face, and he said the thing that I have carried around ever since, the thing that turns this from a sad story into the other kind of story, the kind that asks something of you. He never read it, Eli whispered. 11 years, his boy's last letter, and he never opened it. He was too scared of what it'd say. He looked down at the sealed envelope in his shaking hands. And now he's gone and handed the whole thing to me. Want to tell you Eli read it right then. He didn't. That's the thing about the boy that I've come to admire most, and it's the thing that made everything after so hard to watch. He was poor as dirt, he was tired, he was sitting on a concrete floor holding a dead stranger's whole heart in his lap, and the first thing he thought about wasn't himself. It never was. He put the letter down. He put it down like it was hot, and he said, "It ain't mine to open." "Son," I said, "he gave it to you. He signed the paper. Legally, that letter is." "I don't care what's legal." He said it's soft, but there wasn't any give in it. That stubbornness, I'd seen it when he wouldn't sell his horse, and I saw it now. A man's boy writes him his last words, and I'm gonna steam it open on a Tuesday because I won a card game. No, sir. He stood up. His knees popped. He'd aged 10 years in one morning. It's got to be him that opens it, or it don't get opened at all. Now here's where it gets hard, because you have to understand what Eli was giving up. There was a fella came sniffing around by that afternoon. Word travels here faster than the truth ever could. Antiques dealer out of the city, drove a Range Rover, heard a Vane storage unit had changed hands. He walked that unit with a little flashlight and a sour face, and he offered Eli $4,000 cash for the lot, as is. $4,000. To a man who slept in a camper with a cracked windshield. He said the buckles alone might move, and the harmonica, and there was a market for authentic Western estate pieces. He said it right there in front of the boy's trophies, right in front of the photograph. Eli didn't yell at him. I would've. Eli just said, real quiet, "This ain't for sale, mister. Wasn't ever for sale. You can go on now." And he stood in the doorway of that unit with his arms crossed until the man's fancy taillights were gone. $4,000. Walked away from it without blinking, and he still didn't have the rent for October. He came to find me that evening and he said, "I got to give it back to him, the whole thing, but not just dump it on his porch. He can't take it back the way it is, all opened and looked at, that'd be worse. I got to give it back to him right." And I watched this broke cowboy plan the return of a rich man's grief like he was planning a wedding, and I thought, not for the first time, that I'd spent my whole life around the wrong kind of people. It took him 3 days to work up to it. He wouldn't go to the big house. Said it wasn't right to corner a man in his own kitchen with a thing like this. So he asked me to help, and what we did was, we cleaned up that unit gentle as we could and set everything back exactly the way Vane had it. I took photos first so we'd get it right, and then Eli left one thing out. The letter. The real one. Danny's. And then he called the only number the man ever answered, which was the bank, and left word with Cheryl that Cyrus Vane could come to storage unit 114 on Sunday morning if he had a mind to. And there was something there he'd forgotten. I didn't think Vane would come. I truly didn't. He came. He pulled up in that big quiet truck at 9 on Sunday and got out slow, and he looked 10 years older than he had at the poker table. And when he saw the orange door was open and Eli standing beside it, his whole body went stiff, like a man walking up on his own grave. "I told you to sell it," Vane said. His voice was rough. "I told you not to." "You told me to look inside first," Eli said, "so I'd know what I was throwing away." Well, I looked. He stepped aside from the door so Vane could see it, his boy's room, whole and dusted and exactly as he'd kept it. "I ain't throwing him away, Mr. Vane, and I'm giving him back. He's yours. He was always yours. You can't lose him at a card table. It don't work like that. I'm sorry, it just don't." And Cyrus Vane, richest man in the county, the man who foreclosed on my neighbor without blinking, the man carved out of well-bottom cold. Cyrus Vane put his hand against the tin wall of that unit to hold himself up, and his shoulders started to shake, and he made a sound I hope to God I never hear another human being make as long as I live. Eli let him. That's the other thing about the boy. He didn't rush over and pat him or say it'd be all right. He just stood there in the dirt and let a father grieve his son 11 years too late, and he took his own hat off while it happened out of respect, the way you do at a funeral. When it eased, Eli reached into his coat and he took out the letter. Danny's letter. The stamped one. The one that had come while the boy was dying and never got opened because a proud, frightened man couldn't bear what it might say. He held it out. "I didn't read it," Eli said. "I want you to know that. It ain't mine to read. It never was. It's got your name on it and it's been waiting on you 11 years. His own eyes were wet now. "Whatever it says, he wrote it to you, not to me. You go on and let him talk to you." Vane looked at that envelope for the longest time. Long as Eli had hovered over the deck. Longer. His hands were shaking so bad I didn't think he'd manage it, and Eli saw that, and without a word he reached out and steadied the old man's wrist, just held it, the way you gentle a spooked horse. And Cyrus Vane opened his son's last letter, standing in the door of a storage unit on a Sunday morning, with a broke cowboy holding his hand. I was too far off to read it, and I wouldn't have if I could. But I watched his face while he read, and I watched it change, and whatever was in there, I'll tell you what I believe. I believe Danny Vane forgave his father. I believe that boy, dying, reached back to a man who'd been too cold and too proud and too busy, and he told him it was all right, and that letter sat sealed in a box for 11 years while his father punished himself with a grief he was too afraid to even look at. Vane read it twice. Then he folded it, careful, along its old creases, and he pressed it to his mouth, and he stood there in the sun a while. Then he turned to Eli and he tried to say something and couldn't. He tried 3 times. Finally he just got out, "What do you want? Name it. Anything. The unit, I'll pay you. "I don't want your money, Mr. Vane," Eli said, and he almost smiled, and it broke my heart. "I got everything I came for the minute you read that letter. Honest to God, I did." They stood there, those two, the richest man in 3 counties and the poorest, and I don't rightly know how to end this for you because it didn't end clean. Vane didn't hand Eli a ranch. This isn't that kind of story. Eli still had a camper with a cracked windshield. He still didn't have October's rent. Vane offered him work later, real work, good work, and I heard the boy took it, and I heard the two of them got to be something like friends. If a man like Vane can be a friend, and maybe he can now, maybe that letter cracked him back open enough for it. But that morning, Nobody handed anybody a fortune. That morning, a father just held onto a dead boy's last words, and a poor cowboy stood beside him in the dirt so he wouldn't have to do it alone. The last thing I remember is Vane trying to close the door on the unit himself, and his hands not working, and Eli reaching up over him and bringing it down slow, so it wouldn't scream on the track, so it would close soft. Vane put that brass key back in the boy's hand. "Keep it," he said. "You're the only one I ever met I'd trust to have it." And then the two of them just stood there. And I turned around and walked back up the row so they wouldn't see me, an old man, crying over